So I'd love to welcome you all here tonight, as I'm still admitting people. If you haven't joined us before on any of our AGN conversations, Autistic Girls Network is a charity that supports, as the name suggests, autistic girls and their families, and we campaign for earlier diagnosis, or rather earlier recognition of autism in girls, because the alternative causes a lot of issues, and I think we're going to touch on that tonight. So if anyone would like to tweet about what's happening tonight, then if you could use the hashtag AGN conversations, that would be brilliant. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joanna Grace, and she can tell you all about herself.
Hi everybody, so my name is Jo Grace, like Cassie's just told you all, and I'm going to give you my show-off introduction. Ready? So I am a sensory engagement specialist. I am an author. My books sell globally. I'm a trainer. I've done a TED talk. I'm trying to think, it's weird showing off on your own in a room at 8 o'clock at night. I have a master's in special education. I am currently studying for a doctorate in identity and belonging for people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities. I have a background in the world of special education, so I have family members with neurodivergent conditions, including myself, and I have family members with physical disabilities. I first worked as a support worker for a brain injured gentleman when I was 13, and I've been a registered foster carer for children with complex needs. I'm also an education consultant within the UK and occasionally internationally now, and I've been recognised as a national voice. You're listening to a national voice for SEN and a thought leader, which I don't really know what that means, but it sounds like some sort of weird Pied Piper thing. What else? Oh, I had a job inspecting schools for their provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And there's probably some other things that I'm supposed to say in the show off. And actually I know, the one I'm really meant to say is that I run the sensory project. So for the past more than 10 years, I've been running the sensory projects, and the sensory projects run on the understanding that with the right knowledge and a little bit of creativity, inexpensive resources can be effective tools for inclusion. So all of that garbled stuff is my show-off introduction. And just to sort of underline the showing off, I am an adult autistic woman who is in full-time employment, which makes me one of the minority. Only 16% of adult autistics are in full-time employment, and the rest are unemployed or underemployed. And so, like, if I was trying to show off, I'd be like, nah, there you go. But obviously I'm not actually trying to show off to you. I want to do that bit up front, because I'm the sort of autistic where people say, you don't seem that autistic, or you don't look autistic, as I'm sure many of your girls are. And when so all of that work that I've just told you about, none of that is me being professionally autistic. So I'm not a professional autistic, and that's no, I think the people who are professionally autistic are amazing. I think their resilience and their ability to talk about difficult topics as their work life is something that I could never do. I am professionally a sensory engagement specialist, and my focus is people with profound intellectual and multiple disabilities. My focus isn't autism. So I don't generally go around talking about being autistic. Cassie approached me on Twitter because she knows a bit about what I do. I used to be professionally in the closet. I didn't tell anybody that I was autistic. And the reason that I didn't tell anybody that I was autistic was because I was afraid of the prejudice that I might experience within my working environment if I did so. So I work for myself. I am reliant on people booking me to run events for them and to, you know, speak on platforms for them. And that's how I pay my bills, you know. So if people looked at me and thought, well, for starters, if I say I'm autistic professionally, they'll probably think that the only thing I can talk about is being autistic. So they'd look and think, well, we don't need somebody speaking about being autistic, so they wouldn't book me. And then the next thing that they would think is that I wouldn't be very fun to take out to dinner the night before. And to that end, they're probably right. But it would hamper my work life if people knew that I was autistic. And so although I've been running the sensory projects for over 10 years now, I've only been publicly autistic for a few of them. And that came about as a result of one sort of minor outing and one quite major outing. So the minor one is that I am an ambassador for Parallel Lifestyle, which is a super inclusive sporting event. You know, like you get the Paralympics and you get the Special Olympics. There are still people for whom those events would be, they could never take part in those events. And Parallel, which is originally Parallel London, but I think is now Parallel Windsor, is a mass participation sporting event, and everybody is included, everybody is invited, everybody can take part without any hesitation. And I was one of their ambassadors because I was advocating for people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, the people that my work focuses on. All of their other ambassadors have disabilities or neurodifferences. I was the only ambassador on the little page of their website that describes who the ambassadors are, who wasn't disabled in some way. And I was looking at that, and this is an event that showcases inclusion, that is so proud of its inclusive nature and will go, you know, above and beyond to include everybody. And there I was, you know, sat on their website as an ambassador. Like the hypocrisy of not admitting that I was autistic in that context was too much. And so I said to them, you know, by the way, I'm autistic, and they updated my ambassador profile accordingly. And honestly, I figured, you know, how many people, when they're signing up to like do a marathon or do a 10K or do the super sensory 1K event, click on the ambassador profiles. You know, I'm not really telling anybody, nobody looks at this stuff, it's fine. They might click over and scroll through the pictures so that they see if there's any famous people on there. But I didn't really feel like that would out me professionally. I didn't think anybody would notice. And then a few years later, my son became the UK's youngest published author with his book, My Mummy is Autistic, which rather scuppered the being in the closet thing. And obviously I am his mummy, and he wrote it when he was about 4 years old. So I did know that he was writing it, but I didn't know as he was creating that book that it was a book for publication. We imagined that we would staple his pictures together and give them to grandma as a picture book. And then when he'd done it all, you look at it and you think, goodness, I think this is really good. And so I sent it to my publishers, who also thought it was really good, and so he's published. And when your son does that, it becomes very tricky to not tell people that you're autistic, because I so badly wanted to tell them about that book. I was to go, look what my little boy did. And it's a beautiful celebration in, you know, children's felt tip pen drawing of the differences in our brains, and specifically it focuses on the language processing differences that I experience, which is not something I'll be talking about in my presentation, my chat this evening, but it's definitely something that you're welcome to ask me about in the questions when we get to the questions later. So once that was done, people, because I write books, people were sort of expecting me to write a book about being autistic, and I wasn't planning on doing that. But when people put that idea in your head, it just sort of, you think, well, if I did, I would, you know, I'd make sure to talk about this. And if I did, it would be really important to mention this, because, you know, there's not enough information about the experience of women on the spectrum. There's not enough information about the post-diagnosis landscape of adult. Sorry if you can hear that. People are going very fast on motorbikes past my house. There's not enough information about the post-diagnosis landscape of adult identified autism. There is this sort of, I'm expecting that many of you will either be adult identified autistics or will be about to become them, because a lot of times when you have a child that's autistic, you go through that diagnosis process with your child, and as you're going through that process, you're thinking, hang on a minute, this sounds familiar. Hang on a minute, isn't that normal? I do that. Hang on a minute. And all of those little hang on a minutes make you sit there and think, oh, you know, maybe this is me too. And there is a sort of common landscape post-diagnosis to adult identified autism, in that we all seem to go through, I mean, it's very personal to each person, but there's sort of phases that we go through that are similar to each other. I always think it's a bit like, I was going to say the phases of grief, or, you know, like the steps of recovery from alcohol addiction, where there's like, but those are negative things. This is like it's a positive, you know, these phases that we go through in this landscape, and all these things that would have been really useful. They were the things that I wanted to know when I was identified. And so I kept notebooks with this information in, and I read research papers looking at, you know, I wanted to know stuff like what are the brain differences, and what are the statistics around our risk of abuse, and, you know, the statistic that I just quoted to you at the start about our employment and the prejudices that we experience. So I had all of this stuff in notebooks, and people would say to me, you know, are you going to write a book about being autistic, Joanna? I'd go, no, because writing a book takes an enormous amount of time, and it's the start bit where you have to hold the whole book in your head and organize it. That takes a mammoth amount of focus, and I have a job. I'm running the sensory projects. I'm off on trains around the country all week. You know, I haven't got time to be trying to organize such a huge amount of information. And I would say to people, I haven't got time. And then there was a global pandemic, and suddenly all I had was time. And so that's why there's now that book, which is The Subtle Spectrum, which is about the adult identified landscape of autism and all of those things. So the thing that used to make me worried about doing presentations like this is that I worry that when somebody like me, and by like me, I mean, you know, somebody who has a job, and somebody who uses mouth words, and somebody who has a husband and, you know, a friendship circle, and all of these privileges that I have. When I speak about what it's like for me being autistic, I don't want that to detract from the experiences of people who lead more challenged lives. I am very aware, especially, you know, I used to work at a special school, and some of the students at my school were perfectly capable young people who attended our school because they were so overwhelmed by the mainstream experience. And I would hate for anything that I ever said to take away from the very real struggles and barriers that those people experience. But when I have spoken about this, and when those books were published, the messages that I get from people are often from parents of those people. They're from parents of people who lead those more challenged lives. And they say things like, you know, I heard you articulate this, and I think that's what my daughter is experiencing, but she can't say it. And you've given me an idea and something that I can work with as I seek to understand her world. And so that's what I hope It's a bold hope for 8 o'clock on an evening when you're a parent of a 1-year-old and have not had enough sleep and have had at least 2 sips of wine now. But that's what I hope to accomplish by chatting to you tonight. And I only want to chat to you because you don't need a PowerPoint and you don't need a load of statistics. I hope what you need is somebody human and honest, and I was going to say vulnerable, but I haven't fully decided in my head how much of things I want to tell you. So maybe if I just have another sip of wine, then there you go. I'll go with vulnerable as well. So I gave you my show off introduction. If I was to give you my vulnerable introduction, I'd tell you that I'm Jo Grace. I was the baby that refused to be cuddled by their mummy. And I didn't know that until after I was diagnosed. I have 2 children of my own. If they tensed up and pushed me away when I tried to cuddle them, I was the toddler who didn't play right. The staff at my nursery flagged me up to my parents as, you know, this one's not doing play right. Yeah. I was the child who stimmed, so I didn't do a lot of the autistic people that I know do flappy stims. I didn't do flappy stims. I did spinny stims. I still stim now, but I do it in much subtler and more discreet ways, and I don't think people notice. I was the child that ate restrictively. I am the person who only ate beige. I'm sure lots of you know people who only eat beige. I was socially defunct as a child and as a teenager and as a young adult. I probably still am socially defunct. I just don't go out enough to bump into it. And, you know, to really go with things that I don't generally tell people, the scars on my body were put there by me. I've got, you know, if you looked at my medical records, you'd see a list of mental health things. You'd see stuff to do with the wrong eating. And if you, you know, the statistics that I explored in the subtle spectrum, some of them are to do with the increased risk of abuse of autistic people. And I'm one of all of those statistics. You know, I've been sexually abused and I've been abused within relationships. And then more recently, my littlest child is just coming up to his 2nd birthday. So I was pregnant during lockdown. It was a bit of a race, actually, writing the book, because you need to finish the book before you have the baby, because there is no way you're finishing a book after you have a baby. So the book was only just born first. During my pregnancy, the communication differences that I experienced put my life at risk and put my baby's life at risk. And so when people say to me, oh, you're not very autistic, or you're not that autistic, it's a really hard thing to take, because, you know, when your baby's life is at risk, how much more autistic should I be? That feels pretty significant to me. But I do recognize what they mean. They mean that I'm not one of those people who leads a more challenged life, and I am absolutely not. I am a very privileged autistic person. So, you know, if you compare the 2 introductions, like the show-off introduction and the human introduction, you might wonder what happened. Like, how did I switch between being these 2 people? How come I started out as this inept, vulnerable person, and I became this, you know, competent, I was going to say competent public speaker, this crazy woman talking to a bunch of people online from her husband's office late at night. You know, did I grow out of it? Did I go to a therapy that fixed it? No, I am still that vulnerable. I'm still that at risk, and I haven't grown out of anything. What's changed is the context that I'm in. And so it is a case of capacity and context. In a situation in which I can thrive, I thrive. And in other situations, I don't. And that start out statistic of 16% of people being in, 16% of autistic people in the UK being in full-time employment, I was never one of those before I was self-employed. When I was employed as a teacher, I only ever managed to work part-time because the social load of that job was too much for me to sustain full-time work. And, I hope I looked like a good teacher. We got rated as outstanding by Ofsted, and my work was, I won some prizes and things, so I looked pretty convincing, but I wasn't actually capable of doing it full time. So it's very much a story of capacity and context. My professional life now is as a sensory engagement specialist, and that's what I was going to talk to you about today, is the sensory stuff. So as a sensory engagement specialist and somebody who has written far more books about the sensory world than she has about the autistic world, people often ask me on training days and things like this, do you have any sensory differences, Jo? Because I will talk about how it's very common for neurodivergent people to experience sensory processing differences and disabilities. And then, so it's a natural question, so have you got any sensory differences? And I would say, no, I haven't. It's funny that I'm one of the unusual ones. I haven't got any differences. And I said that and I can't stress to you how much a part of that world I am. I am an education specialist. I am a sensory engagement specialist. The whole of my working life is about the senses and about appreciating how people process sensory information differently. And people come up to me and go, have you got any sensory differences? No, because everything I see is how I normally see it. And everything I hear is how I normally hear it. So no, there's no differences. And I only realized 2 years ago, and that's a good few years post-diagnosis, that actually, yes, I do. And I have some quite significant ones. But even as a sensory engagement specialist, I hadn't noticed. And so that idea, like if you were asking your young people, do you have any sensory differences? They're going, no. It doesn't mean that I was normal. Maybe you would take it to mean that the sensory differences that I have aren't particularly significant, which is not the case. Maybe you take it to mean that the sensory differences that I have don't really affect me that much, which is also not the case. The thing was just that I didn't know. And you would think that as the person who has the sensory differences, you would know, but of course you don't, because it's not different to anything when it's happening to you. It's the same as it always happens to you. You can't live in two people's heads. You can't have two sets of sensory perceptions. So how you experience the world at a sensory level is normal to you. And so why would you question that? And so even as a specialist in this field, I didn't recognize those differences until a couple of years post-diagnosis. They had always been there, and I had always known about them in some way, but to actually pinpoint them and articulate them as sensory differences was not something I could do. And it's a weird one, actually, because as somebody who can use language and can articulate and self-advocate for the things that they need, I face a lot less barriers to access in some situations. So, for example, when I work professionally, I now write some of my sensory needs into my contract. So one of the things that I have in my contract is that people who invite me to speak for them will allow me to do so with my shoes off. And that is not a particularly big need that I have. I can cope with wearing shoes. But it's cope. Like if I asked you to lie in a coffin or in a very small room, you could handle that, but you would be thinking, oh my goodness, this is small. Oh my goodness, it's okay. It's okay. I can get out in a minute. I'm not actually trapped here. It's fine. I can get it. It would play on your mind, wouldn't it? For me, when I wear shoes, I'm just really aware that I'm wearing shoes. I'm like, and it feels threatening in the way that being trapped in a coffin would feel threatening. But I just say to myself in my head, you know, it's okay. It's just shoes. It's fine. It's just shoes. It's okay. It's just shoes. I definitely don't have see me socks, because that would just amplify it. And you just go, it's okay. It's shoes. It's fine. It's shoes. Shoes are normal. It's fine. It's fine. It's not dangerous. But because when I'm presenting to people, I want to be able to give them my full attention. I don't want some little part of my head going, don't worry, it's just your shoes. Don't worry, it's just your shoes. And so I take my shoes off. Problem solved. Shoes off. That part of the thought process goes away, and I can give my whole concentration to my audiences. And as somebody who uses mouth words, as somebody who can write that into a contract, I don't have to wear my shoes. If I was somebody who had a greater need to not wear my shoes, I would likely also be somebody who was less able to express that, and I would be forced to wear my shoes. So in a lot of situations, having and using mouth words means that I face less barriers to access. But there's an odd one in that sometimes being somebody who's articulate creates barriers, or not so much barriers as misunderstandings. So people think that I will be able to articulate what I feel, and that's not necessarily true. People think that I know what I feel, and that's not necessarily true. And people think that if I don't tell them what I'm feeling, that I'm making a choice not to do that, and that's not necessarily true. And I think of myself at 15, and I think of my mother trying to support me through the struggles that I faced then, because obviously autism is a social communication difference, and the hormones that you get when you're a teenager are all about the social communication stuff. So I don't think any autistic person finds being a teenager a breeze. It's definitely, if there are any autistic teenagers watching, the best I can say is that it ends. You are not a teenager forever. You just have to survive until the end of it. I was invited to speak on a platform that gives advice to autistic teenagers, like what advice would I pass on to her? And I honestly couldn't think of anything other than just, it will end. It just stay alive, and eventually it will stop. Hopefully there are people out there with better advice than me. But when I was a teenager, I was experiencing a lot of distress and a lot of issues, and things that you're welcome to ask me about if you want to. And my mum wanted to support me, and she would ask me how I was feeling, and I wouldn't tell her. And she would be upset that I wouldn't tell her. She would say, you know, if you tell me, I can help. And the frustration that grew in our relationship when she so badly wanted to help me, and she felt like I was the thing that was stopping her because I wouldn't trust her with this information. That's how it felt to her, wasn't actually what was happening. So there is a condition called elixithymia, which affects 10% of the general population and 50% of the autistic population. And it's to do with your retrieval of words concerning emotions. So your the way that language is stored in the brain is really interesting. That you store your words in different locations in the brain. The one that always tickles me is that your general sort of day-to-day words are in the left-hand side of your brain, and your swear words are in the right-hand side of your brain. And it's possible, you get within the research, you get these examples of, you know, like the nun who has lived her whole life in the convent and is a lovely, lovely, you know, Saint Agatha, whatever, who has a stroke, and the stroke affects the left-hand side of her brain and knocks out her capacity for language, but she retains her ability to swear and lives out her days, you know, swearing at all the other nuns in the convent who, you know, nicely understand her. When you retrieve words as you speak, it's like, you know, those games that you get at fairs or in arcades where you've got a grabby hand that comes down to get cuddly toys, and you have to move the grabby hand around and pick up the cuddly toys. It's like that. You have a process in your brain that reaches for the words and picks them up, And if you are alexithemic, the ability to pick up emotion words is significantly impaired. And when we learned that, my mum said, I can remember you when we're in these conversations. She said you would open your mouth and you were like a goldfish. You would be, because I'd be saying to you, just tell me how you feel, and I would be trying, I would be, you know, opening my mouth to allow words to come out, and none would come. And she said sometimes I used to wonder if I hit you, whether it would like knock them out of you, because it looked like they were there and you were trying to say them, but you just couldn't get them out. And so people thinking that I'm able to say what I feel is a tricky one, and people judging my perceived choice to not express my emotions is another tricky one. And I said I was going to talk about sensory differences. So this is one of the key sensory differences that I experience, and that is a difference to my interoception. And obviously, most people, when you talk about the senses, think about the famous five. And so it would have been kind of me to start with one of them, wouldn't it? You know, your sight. I am going to do sight in a minute, actually, if I don't witter at you too much now. You've got sight, your taste, your smell, your touch, and your, whichever is the one that I haven't said yet. You have a load of sensory systems. So generally on the sensory projects, I run to 7, and I include your proprioceptive sense, which is a sense that is different for a lot of neurodivergent people, and your vestibular sense. So your proprioceptive sense is your awareness of where your body is in space. And if that isn't working, you know, like the sight equivalent would be 20/20 vision. You know, if you haven't got 20/20 proprioception, you won't quite know where your body is in space, and that causes feelings of anxiety. If you've ever had that experience just as you're waking up or falling asleep, just on the boundaries of sleep, have you ever felt like you're falling? What's happening in that experience is that your proprioception is either falling asleep before you or waking up slightly after you, and you experience the world without proprioception, and that is a very anxious feeling. And so for autistic people who haven't got, like, they would be the sort of, if you were like partially sighted, if you're partially proprioceptive, you haven't quite got that full awareness of where your body is in space. You are living your day-to-day life feeling a bit like that all the time. And so it's a sensory difference that I experience. But I was going to talk to you about interoception, which is once you start dealing in subconscious senses, it's a bit like gateway drugs, and it's really easy to slide into more. And if you want to get technical about it, you have 33 sets of neurons that control your senses. So arguably you have 33 sensory systems, but don't get me started. Your interoceptive system is a really unusual one, because all of your other senses are about sensing the external world, and your interoceptive system is the sense that senses your internal sensations. So I don't know if you've ever, I was at a conference, and somebody was leading a session on mindfulness, and they said, I just want you to close your eyes and feel your heartbeat. And I was looking around the room as like 200 people shut their eyes and felt, it was like, hang on a minute, is that a thing you guys can do? How are you doing that? I have no idea what my heart is doing. They're like, put your hand, you think, okay, I can feel it if I like press on it, but are you just like feeling your heartbeat? That's really weird to me. And they think, oh, here's another sensory difference I'm discovering. But what your interoception does is it feels your feelings, which you need two words, you know, it's the thing that looks at your feelings. So when somebody says to you, how do you feel? And you've had like a really bad day at work, so your shoulders are really tense and you've been frowning and your stomach's churning. When somebody says, how do you feel? You go, I feel stressed. But you don't just know that straight away. What you do is you look at your body and you recognize tense shoulders, frowny face, churny stomach, and you go, stressed. Or on another day, you might be really like, fine, and they go, how do you feel? And you go, oh, and you recognize shoulders are relaxed, face is, you know, happy, stomach is calm, and you go, I feel happy. But what you're doing when you report those emotions is you are sensing them first. And if you haven't got the sense that does that sensing, you can't do that report. And it doesn't mean that you don't have the emotions. You still have the emotions, but you can't feel them. And feeling your emotions is really important for being mentally healthy, for making choices in life. You know, think about if there was somebody that annoyed you, who you didn't get on well with, when you're with that person, you would feel yourself starting to get, you know, and you think, I'm not going to hang around with this person anymore. If you don't feel that, you get more and more tense and you don't know why, and you stay in the presence of that person and it gets worse and worse and worse. So being able to sense your own emotional landscape is really important. And a lot of therapies are based on the mental health requirements of non-autistic people, and a lot of them are based on talking about how you feel and using, you know, emotion words and all these things that are not necessarily accessible to autistic people. I can give you some examples. I've mentioned that I run training days, and I really love doing that. I am so excited that I get to talk to people, and I get to talk to people about something that I'm interested in. I'm living the autistic dream, aren't I? I get to talk to people about my topic of interest and they want to listen to me. Like, this is like autistic jackpot, isn't it? So I absolutely love doing it. And I have a very lovely husband, and at the end of a training day, I'm normally just sort of chewing words. I'm not very coherent. It's just not in a stressed and desperate way, just I no longer make sense. And he will put me in a dark room and make me my favorite dinner and switch the television on and just leave me there to decompress. And I went to this day and I had a fantastic time, and I got back to the room and the dinner and the decompression television, and I was just sitting on the sofa like this, watching the television and eating my dinner. And he looked, bless him, he waited a while. He looked across at me and went, "Okay, Jo, what are you doing?" And you think, what? And then I realized that I'm doing this, and you think, oh yeah, what am I doing? And what had happened was I'd smiled so much that day. You know, when your face hurts because you've been smiling so much, I'd smiled so much because I was happy that my face was hurting. And I said to him, my face is too high up. I was trying to pull it back down. And even at a point where I was trying to claw my own face back down to like a more normal expression, I hadn't realized I was happy. So I definitely experienced differences in my interoceptive processing. And that's a fun example. But in my life prior to diagnosis, and actually more specifically in my life prior to living with my husband, that inability to recognize changes in my emotional state put me at risk, because your emotional life and your physical health life are intertwined. It used to be that we didn't recognize the link between physical and mental health, but now we see it very clearly. There's lots of good research that shows you know, your increase in vulnerability to illness when you're down, and the interplay between these two things. And what would happen is that I would be in positions of stress and not recognize that I was in positions of stress and stay in them for a really long time. And stress has a physical effect on the body. And so I would end up in emergency medical centres. I made lots of trips to A&E in the small hours, and then I'd be on, you know, super powerful antibiotics as a result. And the doctors were looking into, you know, I had 12 in the year before the pandemic, I had 12 separate emergency trips to medical centres. I was prescribed fancy drugs 12 times. If you were watching me on social media, you would have seen none of it, because I am out as autistic, but not completely, you know. And I don't show off about the things that I fail at, and I fail to take care of my physical health. That's how I saw it anyway. Now I live with my husband. He tells me how I feel. And it might seem like a really counterintuitive thing to do, but as somebody who doesn't know how I feel, having somebody just tell me is really useful. Like, oh, you seem happy today, you seem stressed today. And if it goes a few days of him saying, oh, you seem stressed, you sort of start to think, oh, I wonder what's causing that. And then you notice what's causing it, you stop doing what's causing it, and you don't end up at A&E. So having somebody who knows you well tell you what you feel and tell you how they know, you know, if he can show me the external cues that he notices to tell me about my emotional landscape, then I can start using those cues as well. I've got 2 more minutes to talk to you before I said I'd stop and take questions, and I can see questions popping up in the chat, and I'm super aware that I've only really done one sensory system, haven't I? I briefly mentioned proprioception, but if I do a big one, so your vision is a third of your cerebral cortex. It's a huge cognitive demand in the brain, and the visual processing differences of autistic people are sort of noticed, but not fully. And this is one of those situations where I clearly did know that I had different visual processing. So I can remember on the school field when I was about 8 years old, during the summer, we'd be allowed to play, instead of playing on the playground, we'd be allowed to play on this big field. And I would stand near the dinner ladies, not so close to them that they told you to go and play, but just close enough that people wouldn't pick on you. So my playtimes were just sort of stationary near dinner ladies. And I was standing there one day, and this boy who had been playing football out on this field came up to the dinner ladies crying because he'd broken his watch, and the little metal pin that held the strap onto his watch had fallen out somewhere in the football field, and he was upset. And I remember just thinking, oh, well, I'll go and pick it up for him. And I just walked out onto the field and picked it up. It was easy for me to see that tiny little metal pin in a huge field of grass. So, and I knew that I could do that and that the other children couldn't. But obviously I didn't think that I had visual processing differences. No, I see perfectly normally. The best analogy I've found for this is the difference between modern day televisions and the old cathode ray televisions. If you're as old as me, you'll remember when televisions were really fat and they'd got the cathode ray at the back. And the way those old televisions dealt with the image on the screen was that they would scan across it. So there'd be a little sort of flicker running across the screen from left to right, and it would scan each pixel to see whether it needed to change color. So as it's scanning up here, it's going, these are all the same. And then as it gets to the bit where my head's wobbling, it's going, these ones are different, they need to change. And the effort to do that, you know, the energy required by the television to do that is huge, because it has to look at every pixel for sort of every frame of movement. So that if you had a fancy television, it did it quicker. The modern day televisions take a digital image and they know what all those pixels are, and then they only update the ones that move. So they don't have to look at all of these pixels. They don't have to scan all of these pixels. They just focus on the ones that are moving. And that's a really lovely analogy for the difference between autistic sight and neurotypical sight. Autistic sight sees everything all the time, and neurotypical sight takes an image and then only updates the bits that are significant or the bits that move. And so you get these experiments where people, I saw one where people were invited to a dinner party with their friends in a house that they're familiar with, and then they film them, and afterwards they go, did you see the gorilla? And they're like, no. I was like, there was a gorilla there. I would have definitely noticed if there was a gorilla. And then they show them the film, and there's a big like cardboard cutout of a gorilla leaning on a wall, and they haven't seen it. And the reason they haven't seen it is because they walked into that room, they used the image that they have of that room, and then they only looked at the bits that moved. And so they didn't actually, they physically didn't see the gorilla, whereas an autistic person will see everything every time. And for me, I find that really, really challenging in day-to-day life. I'm sat in my husband's office. This is a very visually cluttered environment, and it takes something from me to be in a space like this. And when I think about autistic overwhelm and overload, quite often what happens is that we focus on the thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And we think that that thing that tipped you into overwhelm or overload is the problem. And clearly that is a problem, because if it can tip you into it, then it needs addressing. But actually, if we took away some of the just background demand, like if I didn't have to deal with sitting in an office this cluttered, I would have more capacity for meeting the demands of other things that are challenging to me. I can see lots of questions coming in now, so I will pause, and Kathy may or may not be able to work out which questions I should answer, or I just give it a go and read them, whatever you would like, Kathy.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to use I'm going to abuse my power, and I'm actually going to ask you to talk about something which is kind of typical maybe of the cohort of Autistic Girls Network Facebook group, where I would say that many young people are diagnosed as teens. And if you had to generalize, obviously there's always going to be exceptions, but if you had to generalize, a lot of them would have mental health issues which are caused by not being recognized as autistic, and having to mask and having to be unsupported in a non-autistic world. Anecdotally, I think, and based on what we see in the group and also based on my personal experience, I think that the combination of interoception and alexithymia is really, really significant in that cohort.
Yeah.
And I would say that those are the most important things that parents need to upskill themselves on. I don't know how you feel about that.
So I would put proprioception in there as well, just because the generalized sort of feeling of anxiety, it's a very simple adapt to address that. And the addressing of proprioceptive differences is what any of those sensory resources that tell you where your body is in space do. So being in cold water will tell you where your body is in space, standing in the breeze. You know, I've done adaptations in classrooms where I've just had somebody be allowed to sit near an open window, because the breeze on your face gives you information about where you are in space. Weighted blankets, compression wear clothing, all of those things. You don't have to buy the fancy expensive stuff. It's knowing what it's doing at a sensory level that is useful. But with regards to interoception and alexithymia, the alexithymia one is fairly straightforward, isn't it? If you can't retrieve your words because that, you know, function of your brain isn't working, then we can't ask you to be using those words. A lot of people have that danger of being somebody who is articulate, is that people assume that you have that level of capacity at all times. You know, and I can sit here and explain stuff to you now, and hopefully I sound reasonably coherent because I've only had 4 sips of the wine, and I make sense. But my capacity to articulate my experience and my landscape and all of that, if I was stressed or if I was in pain, or, you know, would be markedly different. I have times when I can't talk, so when I become a non-verbal autistic person, and so that fluctuation in ability is significant. The interoceptive thing, the risk is that people don't understand that this is a brain difference and not a behavior or a skill that you would practice, and that they think that you just fix it. Because what happens then is that you get asked to do things that are so like mindfulness is one of the things that's meant to be really good for interoceptive awareness. And if I say to you, if you have your autistic teen and they are experiencing a mental health crisis and they've got these sensory differences, and somebody goes, okay, you're very anxious, you're suffering with your mental health, what you need to do is mindfulness. There's loads of research about mindfulness. Mindfulness is a wonderful and brilliant approach to mental health. It's well documented. It's got a huge evidence base. All of that evidence base is based on neurotypical brains. All of that evidence base is based on non-autistic people. And it's not even that we sort of are represented there in a minority, we are actively excluded from that research. So when they, and I don't just mean research into mindfulness, I mean all mental health research, when they take a sample population to do a study on, they will look through that population and go, oh, is anybody here autistic? And if they are, they will be removed. So there isn't the mental health research for what we do in response to autistic mental health situations. But if you were that person and you got told to do this mindfulness and to do this thing and it didn't help you, you then are somebody who has that problem, you've been told this is the solution to the problem, then you aren't able to do it, so you feel bad because you're not able to do the thing that you've been told is the solution, and you feel less able to solve your own problems in future because you know that when people give you the solution to these problems, you're not actually capable of doing it. And so a mismatch between neurotype and mental health approach not only doesn't help the mental health, it can actively make it worse and perpetuate it.
Yeah.
With regards to interoception, that thing I said about my husband telling me how I feel, if you are missing the sort of the internal workings that do that, the best that you can do is externalize it and habituate it, and it becomes like you know, other things that are good for your health, like brushing your teeth. When you teach a child to brush their teeth, they don't want to brush their teeth. You teach them that it's good for them, and you try and make it a habit, and you try and, you know, get them so that they do it all the time. And it's like that. What I should be doing, but I'm not, is I should be taking, like, doing an audit of my emotional self. I could do it, you know, every time I go to the bathroom, I could look in the mirror and see if I can recognize emotions on my face. Or somebody in the chat is saying that body scans are really good. I could, you know, I could routinize when I get up in the morning or when I leave work. I could do a sort of body scan and sort of actively sort of check, you know, if I can't feel it from inside, I can feel from outside whether my shoulders are tense or whether my face is frowning. I can do that scan and make a note and go, this is how I'm feeling. The trouble is, when you're not really feeling it, it doesn't feel important to do that. It's just like the kid who doesn't want, why would I bother brushing my teeth? If mummy's not watching, I'm not going to brush my teeth. And I'm somebody who can sit here and tell you how important it is, but I can't tell you with any good faith that I actively check my emotional landscape. I should, like, it would be good for me. Actually, if you have younger children and you can teach them to do this early, then you're on a head start for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the additional layer of complication, isn't there, that often you don't, or the person, the family, doesn't realize that the young person is autistic until they're already in this mental health crisis. And that's when they get diagnosed, because their behaviors are showing because they're in crisis.
Yeah, and then
and therefore they don't know that they have these processing differences, these sensory differences. Nobody knows. The parent doesn't know, the young person doesn't know, and CAMS doesn't know. And, you know, we won't get into a long conversation about CAMS tonight, but, you know, we've already touched on the fact that CAMS often only offer CBT, which is a talking therapy, which doesn't help if you can't identify your emotions. And if nobody is identifying the fact that you can't do this, then how are you going to be able to identify it yourself? It's very difficult, isn't it?
One of the things that you find is a lot of autistic people pick up a collection of mental health diagnoses that actually aren't accurate. So one of the diagnoses that I have received multiple times through life is that I am depressed. And the reason that I've been given that diagnosis is obviously because I've taken myself to the doctor because it wasn't right. And what's actually happening is you have different emotional processing as an autistic person. So something like Shutdown, a neurotypical person or a non-autistic person could experience emotional shutdown, you know, hopefully just once or twice in life when something really big and significant happens. You know, they witness a horrific car accident or somebody close to them dies really suddenly and unexpectedly. What people say is they say, I just felt numb, you know, and that's it's specifically that they say. And what they are reporting as they experience that shutdown is that I'm in a situation that ought to have a lot of emotions associated with it, and I'm not feeling any of them. And our way of saying that in this country is to say, I felt numb. I felt nothing. Because what's happened is it's like a computer system crashing, isn't it? There's been such an emotional demand on the brain that it literally just can't process it all, and it goes and switches off. And within autistic brains, what we think happens is that we experience shutdown far more often. So, and it's not in relation to how serious an event was, although obviously if an event is very serious, that would put an extra load on you. It's more like it's just to do with the quantity of emotions. So for me, I will experience shutdown probably a couple of times a month. And it's like I have the capacity to, it's like running an old computer where like every once in a while they just give up. I have a capacity to process a certain number of emotions, and it doesn't really matter what, like it can be happy emotions, it can be sad emotions, it can be stress, it could be, you know, it doesn't matter what they are. Once my brain gets to its limit, it just shuts down and reboots, and it goes really fast and it comes back gradually. And for me, that process is sort of 2 or 3 days long. And I would have experiences where I felt nothing, and you look at your family and you don't feel anything for them, or you look at your I was a Radio 4 documentary about my first marriage, and this is what that was about. Is that I used to sit there, I was young and in love, and we had a little house, and we had a cardboard table, and we had friends around to dinner, and we were fostering, and I loved, he was beautiful and kind, and I loved him, and we were all sweet and lovely. And then some days I'd sit there and I'd look at him on the sofa and not feel anything, and you think, well, something's wrong here, because I don't feel anything for you. And I worry about it, and then it would be fine, and I'd be young and in love, and he was lovely, and he'd be all lovely again, and then it would happen again, and you'd think, and it happened so often that I began to think, well, there must be something wrong, there must be some sort of dark secret at the heart of our marriage. And we got divorced because I thought there was something wrong, you know. And I've gone to the doctors in that shut down state and gone, I don't feel anything, and they go, oh, you're depressed. And when they tell you that you're depressed, you think, oh, I'm a depressed person, and you go looking for the solutions that answer depressed people. And it's not, you know, if they'd just gone, oh, you might be autistic and in shutdown. I'm married again to I have good taste in men, so I'm married to a lovely man, and I still experience shutdown. I sit on the sofa next to him and I look at him and I think, I don't feel anything for you. And now, post-diagnosis, with an understanding of my emotional landscape, I go, oh, well, I'll just wait till Thursday. You know, it was absolutely destroying of life without that understanding of my neurodifference. With that understanding of my neurodifference, it's nothing more than a shrug. And so the mental health problems that were ascribed to me as being depressed and all of that, part of the sort of seriousness of them was born out of a misunderstanding of my emotional processing and landscape as an autistic person.
Yeah, and if there are any teachers on here tonight, you know, this is like a whole different level of complexity of not understanding the autistic young people that are in your school. And this isn't a criticism of any teacher, by the way, because, you know, it's very difficult to understand, isn't it? But it's something that we all have to be aware of, and that we all need to educate ourselves about, because the mental health of our young people is really, really deteriorating, and we need to do something about it. I'm sorry if there keep being noises. My dog is a bit demanding of my attention at the moment.
I think in many ways it's sort of similar to the gay narrative of the 1950s. If you were the parent of a young gay child in the 50s, you probably would have known that they were different. You probably would have been aware that their difference was one that society didn't approve of. And then you would have acted in sort of one of two ways. You would have either tried to make them straight, or you'd have gone, okay, you know, I see who you are and it's okay by me. And if you think of the experience of that child, you know, the gay kid in the 1950s, they grow up knowing that they're different. So I'm quite often in those conversations where people say, should I tell my child that they've been diagnosed, that they're autistic or not? And it's not like telling them is going to be news. It's just going to be the word that goes with something they already know. What you would want for that young gay person is for them to witness adult or older gay people living happy, healthy lives. You would want them to know that they were gay and to be proud of being gay. And once they have that understanding and that representation, you want them like marching in pride. And if you look at the mental health stuff around being that child, prior to knowing what you are, your mental health is awful. You know, when you know what you are, but you think what you are is a terrible thing, your mental health is very bad. At the minute you're, you know, marching down the street, waving your pride flag, your mental health is suddenly better, you know. And it's not, that's an oversimplification, but it's not the being gay that causes the mental health, in the same way that it's not, there's nothing defective about the mental health of autistic brains. It's not a brain difference that causes mental ill health. It's that lack of understanding. And so if you're a parent looking to support an autistic child, what you want to find is the really positive elements of the autistic community, autistic art and culture, and other autistic people that they can identify with and look up to and celebrate, with that understanding their neurodifference. Because the brains are useful. These different brains are good for stuff.
Yeah, and if anyone does want a bit of a helping hand with that, on Autistic Girls Network YouTube channel, we have a short film called Neurodivergent Lives, where people recorded what school was like for them and what they are doing now, which is often absolutely nothing to do with what they studied, what they went to university and did, or anything like that. In fact, we have somebody who's bottle feeding a lamb because she is now a shepherd. So yeah, that's a really good thing to go and have a look at. Right, let me get to some questions. So first one from Beth: did you find your fears were realized when you came out as autistic?
It's difficult for me to know, and I only came out as autistic professionally once I was in a position where I felt I could afford to take the hit, if that makes sense. It was interesting with regards to the ways that people in my life responded. And again, it's a really similar narrative to the gay narrative. You know, like when gay people come out, and they come out to their grandparents and their friends, and you get different responses. It was very like, some people went, yeah, of course, tell us something we don't know. One of my closest, dearest friends just went, no, you're not. Who told you that? And I was so winded by that. And then somebody else who I didn't really know that well, she had the best reaction of any. She said, oh my goodness, you must be exhausted from masking. And it was just like, oh, that's such a lovely thing to say. So yeah.
Okay. Right, so the next one is, how did you get into the kind of work you do with schools? I'm autistic and currently work in a provision, and there's so much I'd like to change. Yeah, but there's a lot we'd all like to change.
That's my capacity and context stuff. So through the course of my career, I've done more of the stuff that I'm good at and less of the stuff that I'm bad at. And because of the social communication differences that I experience, I don't play well in teams. I'm perfectly nice. I'm just really ineffective in a team. I hope I'm perfectly nice. So I work for myself, and working for myself has enabled me to decide what the job is. I make the job. The trouble is, I'm my own boss, and my boss is really mean, and she doesn't give me any time off.
Yeah, my boss doesn't either. Okay, so the next question, people sometimes expect more verbally, adaptability, regulation, etc., because you are articulate at times. How can we get professionals to understand and support this more?
I wish I knew the answer to that one. They definitely do expect a lot more because you're autistic, because you can use words. And they expect that if they can explain to you what they would prefer that you did, and you can understand the explanation, that would make it possible to do it. I think the thing to underline to people is that it's a neuro difference, not a behavior difference, because what they witness is a behavior difference. And if they think it's just a behavior that you just teach you not to do, we're back to the gay narrative, aren't we? If they're in the closet and masking, that is not good for your mental health. You can perform beautifully straight and it doesn't make you better. You know, I can do a beautiful impression of a neurotypical person in certain contexts, and it doesn't make me not autistic. And the stuff, when I was writing The Subtle Spectrum, one of the things that I was particularly interested in just for myself was I wanted to know what those brain differences are. There are differences in our grey matter, there are differences in our white matter, there are differences in the connectivity of our brains, in the way that our brains, there are very significant sort of real differences that people can take a photo of in a brain scanner and show you. And challenging professionals to think about those things would be really great. But I think it is an incredibly difficult ask for those professionals, because many of them are very willing to understand and many of them want to help, but they do jobs that are so incredibly time pressured. It's like I was one, you know, when I was a teacher, I worked all of my weekends, all of my evenings. I have friends who are teachers, they get up at 5 a.m, they go to work, they finish doing their work at 11 at night, and they're only doing the stuff that's sort of mandatory for the schools that they work in. If I said to them, okay, now I want you to sort of research this other condition on top of everything that you're doing, they'd have to say to me, well, which part of my life, you know, I've only got sleep left aside from the work that I'm doing. The pressure that those people are under is extraordinary. So I don't think it's malicious that they don't understand. It's just you don't understand the things you don't understand, do you?
Mm. And let's reframe that question slightly to kind of bring in these teenage girls that we're thinking about the experience of a teenage girl. And of course, 72% roughly of autistic young people are in mainstream school, so they are going to be thought of as relatively articulate, obviously depending on the person. Some will be extremely articulate. There is that perception that if you are in a mainstream school, you can cope with everything that belongs with being in a mainstream school. And we know that many mainstream schools, almost all mainstream schools, are not inclusive of autistic pupils or neurodivergent pupils generally. I wonder if there is a way, other than things like the Autism in Schools pilot, which is going on now in England, and is funded entirely by NHS England, even though it's entirely in education, because they realise that the mental health needs of autistic pupils are going to be served by educating the education professionals that are supporting them. You know, it's going to be a long-term thing. The idea was of the Autism in Schools pilot was that it would bring down tier 4 CAMHS referrals, inpatient CAMHS referrals. Now, that's going to take a long time to happen. I mean, I certainly hope that it will happen and that it does happen. It's not going to happen just because of one pilot where people were in school with young people for 6 weeks of the year. That's not realistic, is it? So is there a way that we can help professionals just understand more, not necessarily make big changes, but how can we help them to accept that what we're saying is true? How can we get them to listen to us?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the professional, isn't it, and what appeals to them.
Yeah, and many professionals, of course, do listen to us, I should say.
Yeah, I think the thing to understand is that it is you that is going to be the provider of that information, because I quite often encounter families who think that the SENCO will be able to help them with their child's needs. And those SENCOs don't have access to the training that they need to do those jobs. So they don't have the knowledge. But if you can share that knowledge with them, if you can give it to them in like a nice, simple, digestible, well-evidenced way, then hopefully they would take it and use it. I just, to give you a little insight, I speak at education events, and I was booked for a Senko event that was being held in the Hilton in London. So it's this big glossy event, you know, with the big thick tablecloths and glasses and, you know, little name tags and all of that. And the lead speaker of the day was a lord or a lady, a big important person, and I was second up. And I was aware that the Senkos that were in attendance, the schools that had sent them had paid the ticket price of this event, which was a significant ticket price, and it was a national event, so they've shipped the Senkos in from around the country. So the schools that have sent a Senko to this event are really investing in their Senkos, that, you know, they're willing to send them on this training day. So I was thinking as a presenter that I was going to have a very informed audience, and so on the train on the way up, I sat there adding in extra slides to my presentation and adding in like extra complicated bits and all of this. And the first speaker of the day presented a presentation on the acronyms used within special education, and the beginning of their presentation was an explanation of LD, SLD and PMLD. The LD refers to people with learning disabilities. The SLD refers to people with severe learning difficulties. They also had ASC and ASD, autistic spectrum. And I was thinking, I was sat on the speaker table, I was thinking, oh goodness, like how embarrassing for this speaker. They obviously haven't looked at who their audience is going to be. They've just turned up and they're really patronizing these people. And then I turned around and I looked at the audience, and it was a bunch of people going, oh my goodness, I'm so glad somebody's finally told me. I was too embarrassed to ask. And I deleted, you know, take that slide out of my presentation, take that slide, because they don't get any training that's, you know, of the quality that you would want. So you are the providers of that information.
Okay, so next question, what can we do to support teens with alexithymia?
I think that one, because it's a functional difference in the brain, is literally just recognize that it's a thing. If they're not going to be able to use words, don't be expecting them to use words. Some people find that symbol communication is more easily accessible. I've seen people develop physical, like if I go and stand by this window, that means such and such. But if you partner alexithymia with not being able to recognize your emotional landscape, you've got even more problems. And I think what you're looking to do is to have the people around them be responsible for reporting their emotions, to be attuned to them and to know how to recognize them. And if you're their primary carer, then you probably do know how they're feeling, and to trust your instincts on that. And there's lots of this, the polyvagal theory research is beginning to indicate why it's not just like a gut feeling. There's genuine stuff going on there. But if you know how they're feeling and you have things that you pick up on, that, you know, that's what they do when they're stressed and that's how they show that they're relaxed, and you can communicate those to the people around them who are going to be supporting them through the day, and then they listen to that communication, then that's the sort of thing that you're looking to do. But there's not a simple fix for that.
Yeah, and I could add, as somebody who has a very, very alexithymic daughter, that I didn't, you know, we've only really quite recently realized that is also you can kind of either try to agree with them ways that they can show you, like they put something in a certain place or something like that, or you can just open your eyes a lot more and realize that that's what they're doing without having told you that, because they don't have the words to tell you that. So I know when my daughter's mental health is getting really poor, because she will leave I think I'm not going to actually say the word, but she will leave things that are dangerous around the house, and I will think, okay, I will move them, and I will think, okay, we need to take extra care at the moment. And also, if you're trying to have a conversation, don't do it when you need to make eye contact, or you're looking at each other, or you're opposite each other. You know, go for a walk, go for a drive. Much easier to have conversations that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. There are times when professionals try and persuade children or teens into situations that cause sensory overload because they think it's good for them. What are your thoughts on that, and how can you explain why that can be damaging?
So there are two. You made me think there of, so I know a lot of young autistic people who are refusing to go to school, and the schools will say just come in for a little bit and then build up. And quite often the reason that they are refusing to go to school is because they have burnt out in the school environment. And this is not something that I have a huge understanding of. This is something that I read about within the autistic community, but the general sort of rule of thumb is that if you burn out in a location, that location is, you don't go back there. You might, the little by little approach to returning to a location of burnout is just sustaining that burnout, is like perpetuating that trauma. I can see why it's a sensible strategy for a different sort of school refuser, somebody who's got anxious and worried about going to school, and it takes the pressure off because you only have to go for an hour in the morning and then you get to go home and all of that. It's not a bad strategy, it's just not a relevant strategy for this population. With regards to the exposure to sensory stuff, that comes from an understanding of what the sensory differences are. And I don't know if you noticed, but when I was talking about it, I referred to sensory processing differences and sensory processing disabilities, because we're much more aware now that people have sensory differences, and you see it in like the general population are aware of their young people's sensory needs, and we've got sensory toys on sale for the general public, and it comes across as a sort of like it's a phase we're all going through. It's a sort of fad, and it doesn't get the respect. It's good on one hand because we've got increased awareness, but that increased awareness is making it sound like it's just like snowflakes making a fuss of their children or something like that. So the important thing is to realize that the research was done, I think it's 2006, might be 2009, where they showed a physiological difference in the brains of people who have sensory processing disabilities. So it's like your senses have volume controls, but like really, you know, the mixer desks that DJs use, it's like that level of volume control. And as you use your senses to connect with and engage with the world, you are tuning in your senses to enable you to make those connections, engagements. And for people who have sensory processing disabilities, those, you know, tuning things are broken. You know, if you took the population of people who are currently identified with sensory needs and differences and inspected them for that physical disability, I'd be willing to bet that only a tiny fraction of them have it. What's happening for the rest of that population is that they have developed their sensory capabilities in a way that is different to what we typically expect. And so all of your sensory skills are skills, they are a learned thing. We don't really recognize it because generally people learn them so fast, you don't notice it happening. But if you think about it, we do give babies black and white picture books because we recognize that they're not at the same level of sight as us. And so there are things within your sensory capabilities that you're able to do like from the moment you're born. And then the other things are things that you learn later. And I always draw the analogy with maths. So it's like you start off and you've got experiences of one and many, and then you do counting, and then you do adding, and then you do more, you know, and all the way down to the stuff where it's just letters. And your later skills are founded on your early skills. And most of us pick up these skills in order, and so we can sort of use them really well. But if you imagine somebody doing maths who'd like never learned to take away, sometimes when they're trying to do these higher level skills, they'll be fine. Their processing will be fine. And at other times they just won't be able to do it at all, and they'll look significantly different. And that's what's going on in a sensory landscape. If somebody has missed a sort of vital part of their early sensory development, then some of their later processing skills will be fine, and others will be completely out of whack. And they will present in a very similar way to somebody who has that disability in the brain. And what you would do for this person is you would take them back and go through these early skills. You would do that exposure in the hope that they would learn it. And so that idea that if you go into that situation and you're exposed to it, you will sort of develop your brain and your capabilities is based on that. It is not respectful of the very genuine physical disability in the brain that is a sensory processing disability. And people will go, the brain is neuroplastic. Yes, it is, but it's not as neuroplastic as all of that. Like, it will adapt and it will find ways around, but it can't just grow that bit back. It's suggesting that practicing sensory processing would fix that is like suggesting practicing walking would grow a leg back. It's not going to happen. The most likely thing that will happen is that you will put that young person in a position of stress and expect them to mask it, and their masking skills will develop beautifully. And then if you look at the research around masking, you'll see the kickback from that in our mental health stats. It's a fundamentally bad for your health thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So the next question, and I'm really sorry everybody, but we're definitely not going to be able to get through all the questions. What would have helped you when you were younger to develop proprioception and internal perceptions to know what you feel?
Yeah, so I have those differences, so nothing. Those differences are with me because I have a neuro difference. I have a different brain type. I cannot practice and get them back. What would have helped me is the adaptive strategies. Like, if you think about it as being the one-legged person, if I was one-legged, you wouldn't focus on trying to get me to grow a leg. You would focus on giving me a prosthetic or finding me a wheelchair or making the steps in your house smaller. And that's the shift in focus that's needed there. It's not about changing those differences. Because there's the two populations, you could try some of the things that, expose you to those early developmental skills. But when you do that, watch really closely for measurable change, because there's a lot of money made off practices that say just practice, just come to this therapy twice a week, it's only 50 quid a time and we'll fix this, and they make small steps. And I'm from the world of special education, and we thrive off that small steps narrative, because for so many of the students that we support, the steps of progress that they make are very small and they deserve to be celebrated. But it's a dangerous support to just persistently exposing somebody to things that will stress them. By the way, if you don't get a chance to ask me the question, and you still want to ask me the question, I am ever so available online. If you go to my website, you'll find links to all of my social media feeds, and you're very welcome to send me a Facebook message or a tweet or any of these things, and I will answer the questions.
That's great. Helen says body scans really help us, and yeah, that's true. And we do have a webinar on body mapping from a research project that was with teenage girls on our YouTube channel. Very quick question here from Natalie: is alexithymia linked to anxiety?
Simple answer, I don't know, but I'm just wondering if you've got a sort of, I imagine if you're feeling anxious, any of your functions are going to be impaired by that, aren't they? So if you've got a sort of grabber of your emotional words that works a bit sometimes, you're definitely not going to try it when you're feeling stressed. You'd have that reduced capacity.
Yeah, and really all of these sensory issues are all much worse when you're highly anxious, aren't they?
Yeah.
Being able to wear clothes,
Perfume.
restricting food that you eat, smells, yeah. Exactly. They're all really exacerbated by anxiety, aren't they? And here's a question from Hannah. She has a daughter who is about to start secondary school in September. She, by her own admission, is more traumatized by change than anything else. Do you have any advice for that transition, with puberty hormones adding an additional complication?
The most hopeful thing you could do would be to buffer how much of that change happens at once. So I visited my secondary school once before attending. So I had, one half-hour visit to go, this is what it looks like here, this is what it smells like here, all of those, other things that you have to do in a day. So if you have more opportunity to spend time there, if they're running any, if they do a school production that you can go and see, so that you're just physically in the space, if you've got pictures that you can look at. I really wanted photos of all my teachers, because the difference between having just one teacher at primary school and then having all of those teachers at secondary school was really hard for me. And I actually got I made a flip book. It was like a sort of crib sheet of all the teachers so that I knew who everybody was. But any information that you can familiarize her with ahead of that transition would be useful, but it's such a big one.
And I've just put in the chat, we've got a blog on our website about a good transition from primary to secondary school. Right, now I have to find where I was in the questions. Hang on 1 second. Right, I do apologise if I've missed anybody out. There we go, I think I'm there. Is there a resource that can help find an autism-friendly counsellor or therapist?
You're better at answering that one than me.
Yeah, you could go to neurodiversity therapy. Oh, now I'm not going to get it right. It's something like Neurodiversity Therapist Collective. I would try there first. If I have a moment, I will go and find you the website. Maybe somebody else would do that for me. Sorry, yeah. I've got no admin support tonight, so I'm doing everything myself. Right, hang on 1 second. Someone says, I don't know how to do body scans. Can anyone suggest a resource I can use? Yes, go to our webinar on our YouTube channel. And there's somebody who did a whole PhD project on it, and who did fantastic stuff with great big sheets of paper and the young people drawing around themselves and then identifying, eventually over a period of weeks, identifying where particular emotions and particular events felt in their body, and it's really, really interesting. Have a look at it. My 15-year-old daughter has been out of school for 3 years now. She did fine at junior school, but was overwhelmed by the secondary environment and eventually dropped out. She was diagnosed autistic after a year, just before the first lockdown. She became extremely withdrawn and has no education or social contact for 3 years now. She tried going into a new school recently, but has dropped out again, and the school can no longer meet her needs. We now have to find alternative specialist provision. She is highly intelligent, but has not been able to engage with education for a very long time now. What can I do to help her?
See, it's a really common story at the moment. I think we all feel a lot of pressure for education to happen at a particular point in life. And actually, lots of people go back into education when they're older. It's not free when you're older. But if she is struggling that much, she doesn't have to do it now. And for her, knowing that she doesn't have to, like once you've taken that pressure off, then it's a choice to go forwards, isn't it? What you can decide when you feel able and when you feel capable. But all the time that you're within that pressure, and it feels like if I don't do it now, I won't get my GCSEs, I won't get my, I won't get my this or that. Whatever it is that she likes to do, whatever it is that takes her away from that overwhelm and that stress, that's the thing to focus on. And if it's not education, then it's not education. But it's a horrible situation, and I'm not the person with the answers. I can understand why she's in the situation. Gosh, if we had the answers, we'd have to set up your own school, things like that, wouldn't you? I don't know.
That's our long-term aim, is to set
up. Is it? Okay, do that. Yeah. Get Kathy to set up a school.
So I'm sorry, I don't know who asked that question. Kim. Kim, my story is very similar. And I would say first, if you haven't got an EHCP, if you actually do want her to go back to some kind of provision, you absolutely need an EHCP. And I'm presuming that she doesn't want to be home educated, or perhaps you can't home educate her. Certainly my daughter didn't want to be home educated. She wanted to be in a provision. And we were lucky in that there is quite near us a very small, very, very nurturing provision that's basically for very, very anxious children. And she eventually got in there, and we are in the middle of GCSEs right now, and she has attended on every day that there was a GCSE. And for me, that was half the battle, of actually her getting her to the exam. I don't care what she gets. Of course, I would love her to pass them all, and I think she probably will. But just getting there, that's, you know, she's already won as far as I'm concerned, because the trauma that preceded these years was extremely significant. And I'm not, you know, it's not my story, and I'm not going to go into it. But that's, if you have a provision near you like that, then that is a possibility. But they are extremely, you know, they are extremely hard to get into because they are so rare. But what you may find is that your local authority is not telling people clearly on the local offer page what the alternative provisions are. So definitely ask in Facebook groups near you, like autistic parent Facebook groups near you, what alternative provisions there are, because you may find some that you don't know, one or two that you don't know at all. Okay, we could talk, probably we do a whole webinar on that really, but this is why you are both working on a bank holiday. Oh, that must, yes, Trisha, you're absolutely right. So we're workaholics.
I do take Christmas Day off, but under duress, and I'm not very pleasant about it.
My brain, because my brain wants to do 25 different things at the same time, I do find it very hard to switch off. I can't just watch TV, I have to do something else at the same time. What would you want your mum to do? And this is probably going to be the last question, because it's all, I didn't realise what the time was. What would you want your mum to do to help you as a teenager with all these additional challenges?
I would have wanted her to put me in positions where I encountered my role models. I'd want there to be autistic people talked about openly within the household, and with, you know, like, they used to have friends for dinner. If their friends who came to dinner were talking about some amazing autistic dancer that they just watched, and, you know, how fantastic they were, or some amazing autistic scientist who just done something, I would have wanted to have heard in my general environment that what I am is okay, because that's not what I hear in the rest of the environments that I experience. And the stuff that directly affects me, you know, the not being able to express my emotions and the not being able to recognize my emotions, it's like a balance scale, isn't it? Like, obviously, if you can solve these problems for me, brilliant. But if all you do is try and solve these problems,
the yellow on your tooth,
we're on one side of the balance. But if you can put stuff in on the other side, you know, if you can boost me on this side, then the problems won't weigh so heavy. So as much as you try and solve these problems, please also try and, like, feed me with all the stuff that would boost me. Did that make sense? My brain normally switches off at about 9 o'clock, so my ability to be articulate is waning.
Yes, I think we've kept you long enough. We are 5 minutes over, which is a little bit naughty of us, but it's not too bad, is it? Could have been worse. So I'm really sorry for people whose questions we haven't got to. I don't think it's too many now. But yeah, as Jo said, like, go to Twitter, find her on Twitter, find her on Facebook. Don't bombard her with questions, but I'm sure she won't mind one.
You're fine. You are fine to ask me questions. I do the work that I do because I want to be useful to people. So if you think that I could be useful to you, by all means, send me a message. I've just put my website in the chat. All the links to my social media are there. So you can send me a friend request, or I'm very polite on Twitter. I'll follow you back.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much, Jo, giving up, particularly on this Jubilee evening. I know neither of us are particularly bothered that it's Jubilee evening, but still, it is a bank holiday, and here we are working, which is very naughty of us, really. We shouldn't do it. So thank you for everyone coming as well and giving up your Jubilee evening, and I hope the rest of the weekend, I hope you are managing to have some time off. Jo, I hope you have some time off this weekend. and I will try to have some, but I do have a master's assignment I have to do, so I might not. Anyway, for everybody who's asked if it is being recorded, yes, it is being recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel at some point. I'm not going to promise that it's going to be really soon because it is bank holiday weekend, but it will be on there at some point next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.